In December 2018, with the release of 1.85, the first ever heat-seeking air-to-air missiles were introduced to War Thunder. Now, over a year later, we have infrared-guided, beam-riding, and wire-guided missiles, plus whatever the hell the Starstreak is supposed to be. So basically we have every kind of missile except for the radar-guided kind, but even those are going to arrive sooner or later. In a somewhat predictable fashion though, Gaijin has provided only a few morsels of in-game data about these missiles. Yes, we have lock ranges, maximum speeds, and G limits, but these stats mean very little without proper context, and in some cases they can be downright misleading. Hopefully this video will fill in some of the gaps when it comes to missile performance and mechanics. First of all, the maximum mark listed on most stat cards is a completely arbitrary number. It has no decidable effect on missile flight performance and seems to serve no other purpose than to suggest how fast a missile might go. In fact, almost all of the stat card values are arbitrary to some degree, but I'll address each of them later on in the video. The variables that do affect a missile's maximum speed are end speed, CXK, force, and time fire. So the first two are related to aerodynamics. End speed is effectively a hard limit on how fast the missile can go, and it's important to understand here that this is a speed limit only. A large number of air-to-air missiles have an end speed of about 800 to 1000 meters per second. There are also a few exceptions that have an end speed of 0, which effectively means that they don't have a speed limit. Under most circumstances though, the only missiles that will actually reach their speed limit are ATGMs. Air-to-air missiles with speed limits of 800 meters per second or higher are very unlikely to ever reach those speeds, especially not at sea level. The reason for this is because of CXK, and CXK is a missile's in-flight drag coefficient. This variable sees more active use on air-to-air missiles or long-range ATGMs like the Vika or Hellfire. A missile's overall drag also scales with its caliber, so in layman's terms, bigger missile equals bigger drag. Moving on to force and time fire, we find that these are extremely relevant to interpreting air-to-air missile performance. To state the obvious, force describes how much force a missile's motor will produce, while time fire tells us how long that force will be applied. The R550 Magic, for example, produces 27,000 newtons, or about 2,700 kilogram force, for 2 seconds, providing an incredible initial thrust-to-weight ratio of 30. Compare this to the R60, which only has an initial thrust-to-weight ratio of 22. Notice, however, that the R60's rocket motor continues to fire for a total of 3 seconds, providing thrust over a longer period of time. But whether acceleration or duration matters more depends on the situation. Having high initial acceleration will quickly boost a missile up to higher speeds, which means better maneuverability and lower time to impact at close range. On the other hand, a longer duration will keep the missile maneuverable over a longer period of time. So some missiles like the R530E can do both of these things with their two-stage motors, the first stage being high thrust, short duration, and the second being low thrust, long duration. It's also worth noting that virtually all missiles have a start speed value, which, as the name implies, defines how fast the missile is moving when it's fired. For most air-launched missiles, this is often set to 0 meters per second. But for ATGMs fired from tanks, it can be as high as 150 meters per second. When it comes to the max range of air-to-air missiles, the main limiting factor at low and medium altitudes is going to be drag. At altitudes of about 9 kilometers and above though, two other factors come into play: max distance and time life. Both of them are quite straightforward. Max distance is another hard limiter like end speed. It simply determines how far a missile can travel from its point of launch. Meanwhile, time life determines how long a missile can remain in flight. For ATGMs, the missile's maximum range is almost always going to be limited by max distance. I should mention that max distance is unrelated to the similarly named range max. In fact, just like Mach Max, Range Max is purely for stat card use and doesn't actually affect the performance of a missile. So although the R530 stat card says it has a max range of 15 kilometers, in reality it's closer to 18. Well, that's all there really is to speed, range, and acceleration, so now we'll move on to the next topic, the mechanics of missile maneuverability. Missiles currently use three different systems to maneuver: fins, thrust vectoring, and something called auto-aiming. Before I get into any details, I'd like to point out that this value here, load factor max, does not affect missile maneuverability in any way. Yet again, this is an arbitrary stat card number intended to give players a general idea of how the missile will perform. Occasionally, however, this value won't line up with how a missile actually performs, which was the case with pre-nerf Shafrir missiles, as well as the SRAM when it was revealed on the first dev server for update 1.91. The value that does limit a missile's maximum G-load is called PropNav Excel Max. As it so happens, this value didn't exist prior to 1.99, meaning that up until now, the limits of missile maneuverability were essentially defined by the fin deflection, thrust vectoring, or auto-aiming values. With that out of the way, let's look at how each system works. So, fins AOA, in conjunction with two other variables called mass and wing area mult, determines how maneuverable a missile is up to its maximum G limit. Unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be any reliable way of calculating how many Gs a missile can pull at any given speed or altitude. But, suffice to say, more is better when it comes to fin angles. It's also worth noting that fins AOA seems to be measured not in degrees, nor in radians, but as a percentage of a 90-degree angle. In other words, a fin's AOA value of 0.5 will produce a fin deflection angle of 45 degrees. On the R550 Magic and AIM-9L, this value is 0.2, which equates to an 18-degree fin deflection. Our second system, thrust vectoring, applies to missiles which use their rocket motor for maneuvering and defines the angle at which it deflects this thrust. This means the missile will lose its ability to use thrust vectoring when its motor burns out. Also, pure thrust vectoring missiles like the SRAM tend to be unstable in War Thunder because they impart angular momentum on the missile regardless of its angle of attack. This results in strange and unpredictable behaviors when firing the missile at low speed. Technically, there are ways to prevent this, but it's complicated and trying to explain it would segue too far from the point of this video. Not all thrust vectoring missiles are unstable though. The Mistral, Igla, and Stinger all use a combination of fins and thrust vectoring. Although the thrust vectoring angle on these missiles is so small that it has a mostly negligible effect on maneuverability. Now, this last system called auto-aiming takes a more gamey approach to missile control. Instead of acting through air surfaces or thrust vectoring, it controls directly where the missile flies. Air-to-air missiles using auto-aiming will attempt to follow the player's aiming reticle, or in the case of most ATGMs and SAMs, they'll follow the tank's crosshairs. The main four variables to pay attention to are aim sensitivity, max axis values, and auto-aiming max angle, as well as operated dist. Aim sensitivity is a general measure of how closely the missile will follow the aiming reticle. Sensitivity values below about 3 or 4 tend to result in sluggish behavior, while missiles with a sensitivity of 5 or higher are more crisp in their movement. Max axis values determines how hard the missile can pull, with the value itself ranging between 1 and 0. I'm not sure what axis this variable is referring to, but in any case, higher is better. Auto-aiming max angle, as the name would suggest, dictates the maximum angle allowed between the player's aiming reticle and the missile. Outside this angle, the missile is no longer controllable. However, if the reticle comes back into view of the missile, then it'll start tracking again. Lastly, we have operated dist. Quite simply, it determines how far the missile can travel from the player's vehicle before becoming uncontrollable. This is not the same as max distance, which instead determines how far the missile can travel relative to where it started. So that's pretty much all there is to fins, thrust vectoring, and auto-aiming, but there's also a few other variables related to maneuverability that I'd like to go over. Two of these are mass and mass end. Mass defines the missile's mass before being fired, while mass end defines the mass after the rocket motor has burned out. When it comes to missiles that use fins or thrust vectoring, mass is one of the more important things affecting maneuverability. As you can see here, this custom missile with an 80 kg mass end can't turn very well. But if we reduce that number down to 20 kilograms, we see that it has absolutely no problem keeping up. The pre-nerf Shafrir missile, which I mentioned earlier, is a perfect real-world example of this. Previously, the Shafrir would lose about 75% of its mass in 2.1 seconds, compared to only about 30% on the AIM-9B. As such, the Shafrir's practical maneuvering limit was far higher than 6 Gs. Although not directly involved with the maneuverability of a missile, load factor limit determines how hard the launch aircraft can maneuver before being able to fire. On the MiG-19 PT, for example, the R-3S missile can't handle anything more than an abysmal 2 Gs. The AIM-9Ds on the Phantom FGR-2 have a load factor limit of 4G, while the R-60s on both the MiG-21MF and SMT have a limit of 7G. Having a higher load factor limit therefore makes it much easier to fire a missile while maneuvering your aircraft. This last variable I'd like to talk about, called timeout, acts as a kind of delay. In the context of maneuverability, it forces the missile to fly in a straight line for a set period of time. This is particularly important to know when using a missile at close range or while maneuvering. The overwhelming majority of missiles have a timeout of only 0.5 seconds, with the only noticeable exceptions being the large R530E on the Mirage 3, with a timeout of 1 second, and the SRAM on the Hunter F6, with 0 seconds of timeout. Okay, that's pretty much all the important stuff related to maneuverability. We've covered a whole lot of information already, but there's still quite a bit more to go. Next up, we'll have a look at infrared seeker mechanics. Missiles with IR seekers have a surprising amount of complexity in their mechanics. Let's look at how lock ranges work for starters. These are determined by the range band variables. Band 0 is for rear aspect only, while band 1 is for all aspect. It's important to note that in practice, these ranges can change drastically depending on how many engines the target aircraft has and what throttle setting they're using. On paper, for example, the AIM-9L has a 6.5 km rear aspect lock range. If the target is an F4 in afterburner though, the missile can easily attain a rear aspect lock from over 10 km away. If the same aircraft goes to 0% throttle, the missile will have trouble getting a lock outside of a kilometer or so. Also, while it's possible to get a head-on lock with a purely rear aspect missile, this can only occur at extremely short ranges, even against afterburning targets. Moving on, we have some variables related to max seeker angles and tracking. Here, the FOV variable determines the seeker's field of view in degrees, which is represented in-game by the small inner lock circle on some missiles. A smaller FOV will usually make the missile less prone to locking onto a different heat source, whether that be a flare or another aircraft. This is why flares tend to fool R60s more than AIM-9s, since R60s have a 5 degree field of view, whereas most AIM-9s have a 2.5 degree field of view. So, while FOV is represented by the inner circle, lock angle max is represented by the larger outer circle. This is how far the seeker can traverse before launch. Having a high lock angle max is very useful for leading targets, which in turn makes it easier for the missile to intercept those targets. Once the missile is launched, however, the seeker is instead limited by angle max, which is typically much higher than lock angle max. The AIM-9E, for example, has a lock angle max of 10 degrees, but a post-launch angle max of 40 degrees. Angle max is especially important when attacking enemies from the side, as it allows the missile to pull ahead of the target and make a successful intercept. If the missile has a low angle max though, it will sometimes put the target outside of its seeker range, as you can see here. This is why missiles with a low angle max, such as the AIM-9B with only 25 degrees, have a difficult time tracking through side-on shots, and can only be fired from directly behind a target under most circumstances. Before I move on, I'd like to say that rate max, which should determine how quickly the missile's seeker can rotate, appears to do nothing. In testing, I found that a missile with a track rate as low as 0.1 degrees per second was still able to follow me through 10G turns. This is probably a bug, but it might also be something that the devs have done to make missiles more reliable. Either way, just remember that track rates don't mean anything. As most people with a top tier jet would know, a common feature of all IR guided missiles in War Thunder is that they take a few seconds to warm up before you can fire them. Not only that, but they can't remain active for more than about 10 to 20 seconds in most cases. Respectively, the warm-up time and work time variables determine how long it will take to warm up the missile's seeker and how long it can remain active. Some missiles, such as the AIM-9E and R-60, can also uncage their seekers before launch. This allows the seeker to lock onto a target and then move around within the limits defined by lock angle max. Compare this with the AIM-9B, whose seeker cannot be uncaged and instead only points forward before launch. Being able to uncage a missile seeker allows us to lead ahead of a target, which is extremely useful when firing from side on. Now, there's a few missiles that have IRCCM capabilities, which stands for Infrared Countermeasures. Essentially, this is just the ability of a missile to ignore flares and other sources of interference. There are a few important variables here. Gate width, for starters, is essentially an inner field of view for the missile seeker. A common feature of Manpad's missiles like the Stinger, it forces the missile to ignore any new heat sources outside of the gate width FOV. So if we have a missile with an FOV of 10 degrees, we would expect it to be very susceptible to flares. If we give it a gate width value of 0.5 though, then it will be very difficult to fool, because any flare will have to pass within half a degree of the missile's line of sight in order for it to have any effect on that missile. Min angle to sun is something that defines the angle at which missiles will lock onto the sun instead of any other available heat source. For most missiles, this value is set at 10 degrees, but can get as low as 5 degrees like on the R530. However, it seems that this is only relevant when trying to lock onto a target. If a missile has already been launched, the sun may not be enough to distract it. This last variable, band mask to reject, is found on virtually all Manpad's missiles like the Stinger, Igla, and Mistral. In all cases, the value is set to 4. As you can see, this provides immunity from the sun, since the sun also operates on band 4. However, the same effect can be achieved by simply setting the range band value to 0. On all Manpad's missiles, for instance, this is done with band 3, and band 3 it belongs to the passive IRCM devices found on helicopters like the Mi-35 and AH-64s. This is why Stingers and Mistrals will work on the Mi-35, while the AIM-9L does not. Alright, now that we've gone over IR seekers, we have one more topic to cover: proximity fuses and how they interact with missile warheads. Proximity fuses are present on virtually every IR guided missile, and even on certain non-IR guided ones such as the Ka-50's Vika missiles. Now, every proximity fuse has a trigger radius, but the missile won't necessarily explode if something is within that radius. Instead, it only triggers on near misses. I'll put it this way: even if a missile has an enormous 250 meter proximity fuse, that missile will still try to get as close as it can before exploding, perhaps even hitting its target directly. Most IR guided missiles will also have another timeout variable attached to the proximity fuse section. which determines the amount of time before a proximity fuse is actually armed. For most missiles, this is about 0.5 seconds, but on the R550 Magic it's as long as 1.8 seconds. The Magic has a very high acceleration too, so there's a higher chance of missing the target completely when firing from close range. For non-IR guided missiles, there are alternative handicaps to the proximity fuse. These handicaps include arming distance and minimal altitude. Arming distance defines how far the missile needs to travel before its proximity fuse becomes active. The default arming distance on all SAMs is currently 300 meters. Additionally, if a missile falls below its specified minimal altitude, its proximity fuse will deactivate until it climbs higher. For most SAMs, this is 25 meters. Finally, we come to missile warheads and how they deal damage. The gist of it is that the TNT equivalent of a missile's explosive mass determines how much damage will be dealt. There's actually a whole plethora of variables related to explosive and fragmentation damage, but surprisingly, these are completely unused in damage calculations when explosive mass is defined. There are a few caveats though. First, every air-to-air missile in the game has a dispersion pattern for its fragmentation damage. That dispersion pattern looks something like this. As you can see, the dispersion pattern determines where the fragments will go, how many fragments are used, and how much extra damage will be applied to those fragments. You'll also notice that there are 4 areas to the front and rear of the missile which have no fragments. All of this is to say that there are zones around a missile that will not deal any damage. However, the effects of these zones are negligible with a direct hit, and are only noticeable on proximity detonations, especially when it comes to missiles with large proximity fuses, such as the French AA-20. This missile has a 15-meter proximity fuse, which is 3 times larger than an AIM-9's. Because of this, the area of the non-fragmentation zones becomes larger, and situations where the missile will do very little damage become more likely. So, if you've ever wondered about the inconsistent damage of the AA-20 or any other missile, this is the reason for it. And there we have it. That's pretty much all there is to know about War Thunder's missiles in their current state. Well, mostly. There are other variables and mechanics at play here that I haven't discussed, but that's because those variables and mechanics are either too abstract or are identical across all missiles. The most important things to take away from this, in my opinion, are maximum seeker angles, rocket motor force and duration, maximum launch limits, timeout delay, and seeker warm-up and work time durations. This is all pretty important information that'll help people figure out how quickly a missile is likely to accelerate, how well it can handle side-on shots, how quickly it can react off the rail, and so on. Proximity fuse radius is a useful one as well, and in fact this is already a common statistic on most ground-based missiles, but not air-to-air missiles for some reason. As for the future of missiles, well, if this post here is anything to go by, we can expect AIM-7s, R-23s, and all sorts of long-range radar-guided weaponry in the near future. Exactly how effective they'll be will depend upon map sizes and the effects of ground clutter. If maps like Boulogne-sur-Mer become more common, and if ground clutter causes a reduction in missile accuracy, then I think they can be balanced. Aircraft radar warning receivers will also give people fair warning that someone is trying to lock them up, and from which direction. But most of this is hypothetical, so we'll just have to wait and see. Before I finish up here, I'd like to give a big thank you to Avarik. He has his own channel, link in the description, and he gave me a hand in setting up custom missions properly so I could test all of this stuff. Well, that's all I've got for now. See you around.